Well, we are going to go ahead and begin. I would just like to welcome everyone to Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Angie Atkinson, one of the supervisory park rangers here at Gettysburg. I'm primarily manage the licensed battlefield guide program, and on occasion get to jump back into the world of interpretation and do some programming. So today, we're going to look at General Thomas Francis Meagher and some of the very exciting aspects of his life from birth to death, and answer, hopefully, or at least discuss some of the questions that surround him. For many of these individuals, not a lot remains. Meagher, though, luckily has some good amount of source material related to him, but there's been some labels maybe attached to him, to his reputation, some stories attached to him, and so maybe we'll tackle some of those today and take a look at his life. To do so, let us begin. So, Thomas Francis Meagher is born August 3rd, 1823 in Waterford, Ireland, to a very wealthy family. The Meaghers had found success in the merchant trade. His grandfather had actually moved from Ireland to Newfoundland and got involved in the trading business, worked as a tailor, eventually taking that income, purchasing a ship to transport various goods back and forth between Newfoundland and Ireland. Things would come back as well: bacon, flour, oats, and in fact the Irish. Individuals would emigrate from Ireland to Newfoundland. Eventually, though, Meagher's father, who would grow up with this business surrounding him, would be made full partner and actually move the family back to Ireland. Unfortunately for Thomas Francis, his mother died when he was 4 years old, and his sister would pass about 10 years later. The home that you're looking at here on the left, or the hotel now, is actually the site of Meagher's birth, though he would spend most of his life here in this house from roughly age 2 on. As I said, they were an extremely wealthy family, raised mostly by their father, of course, with their mother's passing. And the senior Meagher would soon come to realize that Thomas Francis was cut of a different cloth. Thomas Sr. was, I would think, very straightforward, goal-oriented, and very logical. Thomas Francis, not that he was illogical, but was much more of a free spirit. And Meagher was enthralled as he would grow up, as he would hear and see. He would hear stories about English and Irish conflicts. As he would see some of those English and Irish conflicts, he would start to form a picture of the life that he wanted to have and the life that he foresaw for many of the people of Ireland. He was hoping and became enthralled with a movement across the pond, and looked at this revolution in America, this independence from Britain, and hoped that one day maybe Ireland could do something of the same. His education would take place in a number of private schools, eventually leading him to Stonyhurst College when he was at the age of 16. It was a 4-year education that his father was very encouraged with and hoping to settle young Thomas Francis. And in fact, it being a Jesuit education, many hoped that it would actually remove the Irish from the Irishmen. Meagher would walk away, though, with a tremendous education. He was at least familiar with 5 different languages: Latin, Greek, French, Gaelic, and English, and had made a name for himself pursuing what he loved, and that was speaking. The debate societies he would find were really his calling. However, that being all well and good, his father wanted to know, upon graduation from Stonyhurst College, what's the next step? You're not going to speak your way into a career. What are you going to do with this education? He wanted Thomas Francis to end up in the family business, but that just wasn't a good fit for the young Meagher. And the senior Meagher did agree with Thomas Francis on a couple of things. And number one, that there was this oppression of the Irish by the English. However, the senior Mar thought that change should not happen through radical revolution, that it should really be a more controlled process, small inroads when you could make them, don't rattle too many cages, but still try to achieve some level of independence. The younger Mar was completely different. He, seeing a number of things that had happened to his fellow countrymen, wanted one thing, and that was basically revolution. As Mar had grown up, as these seeds of revolution were starting to be planted in his mind by men much older than Mar and predecessors, he wasn't the first guy to think of this, it was slow to take hold. And the timing for Thomas Francis Mar was just unfortunate in that as he was rising to success and really coming of age in his quest for Ireland's freedom, the country itself is going to fall into a famine. Throughout the early 1840s, he's going to test the waters for what is going to be known as the Young Ireland movement, to arouse these young men to ignite their passions for their country to hopefully become a sovereign nation. But, as I mentioned, the timing couldn't be worse. By 1845, the first signs of what would become the potato famine were reaching the shores and being produced in the crops of Ireland. The image to the left is an example of that. As I understand it, the crop looks good initially, at least the first wave of the blight, the crop looked promising, but as the farmers would turn over the soil and find the potatoes, they were basically useless. And this seems to spread through the air. Like wildfire, and it doesn't take much for it to go from county to county, farm to farm, before literally the entire crop is ruined. And I believe the soil is actually able to keep this fungus going. And so multiple plantings are, a replanting next year, hopefully we'll hit them again, does not necessarily guarantee a better crop. But they didn't have to suffer, and this is something that Mar is going to struggle with as he's watching his countrymen deal with the potato famine and the blight. Ireland actually exported a number of goods. They exported large quantities of oats, barley, along with livestock, all to England. And many times, as you are existing on the farm, hoping to harvest your potatoes, the farm across from you is bountiful with many of these goods, but they were untouchable to Irish hands because they were all slated for export. So sadly, the farmers were left with little choice but to watch as the chance of life, as the famine kept and continued to grow throughout the entire country, and a chance of life was literally grown in the fields next to them, but unattainable. Help would come from other countries. Help would come from America. There were Jewish synagogues, Quaker meeting houses, and Catholic churches that would send corn, flour, and even clothing to the people of Ireland. The Choctaw Nation would in fact send a good deal of aid to the Irish. The Trail of Tears still very fresh on their minds. But unfortunately for many of the Irish, even when those items arrived on the shores, they were not easily distributed. In fact, soon there was a requirement that the Irish must purchase these goods. And if you're living on a subsistence farm, you have very little money in which to purchase anything, let alone the food to keep you going. He had not simply ignored his father when it came to being obedient. Mar at this point was kind of teetering between, should I stay the course, should I not rock the boat, or should I search for this revolution that he hoped to have? But as he's watching thousands of Irish flee, coming to America, among other places, he now understood his purpose. The famine was really the last straw for Mar. He would seize the opportunity to cultivate followers of the Young Ireland movement, and England is making things just more and more difficult as the masses are starving. And England was aware that discontent was spreading. They were not ignorant of this fact. And Mar is going to use his speaking skills in July 1846 to solidify his stance in the only way that Ireland could be free, not through diplomacy, but through revolution, through using force. He would say, "Abhor the sword, stigmatize the sword. No, my lord, for at its blow a giant nation started from the waters of the Atlantic, and by its redeeming magic, and in the quivering of its crimson light, the crippled colony sprang into the attitude of a proud republic, prosperous, limitless, and invincible." Where did that inspiration come from? It came from the thousands of men who had already risen up against the crown in America. In an attempt to not have a full-scale revolt, soup kitchens would start to be constructed by 1847, but they were not providing anywhere near the nutrition that the people of Ireland needed. The senior Mar had actually been campaigning for a seat in the House of Commons and had aligned himself with the British Prime Minister. You can imagine that this rankled young Mar quite a bit. One evening in the family's home, Thomas Mar and his father, as they had many times, were discussing Ireland's situation and the picture of the future of Ireland. And Thomas Francis basically looked at his father and said, "You will not have my vote." Thomas, at that point, is going to forge his own path. After engaging his father in multiple debates, pointing out the hypocrisies that had existed and asking how he could knowingly send fellow Irishmen to their graves, Mar pointedly informed his father, "Tell the minister, sir, that a new race of men now act in Ireland, men who will be neither starved as the victims nor serve as the vassals of the British Empire." But he's going to need more support. The support from the people of Ireland is there. However, they're still suffering through and some recovering from the literal depletion of not only resources but people in the country because of the famine. He's going to need to fill the ranks of the leaders of the Young Ireland movement, and he's going to need to get backing from individuals that have experienced the same. So, hearing about the success of the efforts in France and the resulting abdication of the French throne, Mar will travel to Paris to meet the acting foreign minister. Unfortunately, Lamartine had already been warned by the British not to get involved, and he is relatively new to his position. So he, again caught in the middle, is probably not going to rock the boat right away. What Mar will come away with, though, maybe not support in numbers, maybe not support in Lamartine's words, but he will come away with a template, a small template of revolution that is going to mean a great deal for the people of Ireland. He will walk away with a tricolor, and he will help to create what becomes the new flag of Ireland. This, of course, is not sanctioned by England, and Mar will take it one step further, and he will take this flag and fly it above the city of Waterford upon his return. This, a very decisive act of defiance to the crown. And the crown won't stand for it. One by one, the men associated with the Young Ireland movement are going to be arrested and headed to trial for speaking of violence against the crown. But the crown doesn't have a full grip yet on these young Irelanders. During Mar's trial, there is going to be one dissenting vote, a Roman Catholic, and thus he will not be he will be removed from his cell and set free. But England, thinking quickly, will soon pass the Treason Felony Act, which made it a crime to be an Irish nationalist. July 11th, 1848, as his father tried to reason with him, at their home, there was a knock at the door. Mar was to be arrested for seditious language from a speech that he had given. When word spread around Waterford that their leader was about to be arrested and taken to jail, roughly 20,000 gathered to attempt to prevent young Mar from being taken away. Was this the moment that Mar was looking for? Through the past years, he had looked for ways to instill patriotism in his country, instill this idea of revolution, and here it was before him. Was he ready to take hold of it and utilize it? He was not. He would say to the crowd that they should be steady and calm and refrain from any use of force. But it was of no use. They would start to throw stones and formed a human barricade at the bridge in Waterford. Eventually, after a few hours of adjusting plans and bringing in reinforcements, Mar was securely removed from Waterford and taken to a train headed to Dublin. Now, being wealthy, he could afford the bail and was able to return back home to await trial. But now he was ready. That was the final straw. He was ready to seek his next opportunity for revolution. He and the other leaders of the Young Ireland movement would seek to begin this revolution in Kilkenny, and Mar would depart this home July 20th, 1848, for the last time. By July 22nd, England, again in another very strategic move, would suspend habeas corpus, and thus anyone could be arrested at any time for anything. Mar was now a fugitive. Once at Kilkenny, his hopes for revolt began to fade. He realized that the clerics would not support him, as they had just witnessed some going to their death back in France. Few weapons were able to be procured. If you're going to elicit the help of farmers, rifles aren't really in plentiful supply. They'd probably be bringing their implements, their tools. Another plan was then drawn up. Mar and his supporters would take the Rock of Cashel. But on the way there, a police officer, an on-duty police officer, noticed Mar and took him into custody. August 12th, he's arrested, jailed in Kilmainham Jail, said to have levied war on our sovereign lady the Queen and her realm, which will carry the penalty of death. Mar will spend 1 month in jail. He can hear them building the gallows right outside his window. He knows what's coming. He's visited by his father, who begged him to plead guilty to a lesser charge, but Mar, in no way, shape, or form, would concede. The revolution had begun. But it was really a non-revolution. He wasn't really able, physically, to get anything started. Mentally, emotionally, he was there. But physically, the organization of thousands of Irish compatriots was just not coming to fruition. As Mar would say, we were routed without a struggle, a humiliating fiasco. Mar is tried in mid-September, and after 9 days, he is found guilty. At his sentencing in October, his words, I'm sure practiced many times over, could not move the judge. He was to be hanged, decapitated, and quartered. As would be fitting in most legal cases, it will go to appeal, and it will go to Westminster to be heard, but eventually denied. Outside pressure, however, will come to Mar's aid. Outside pressure from the United States and others will help adjust England's thoughts on the matter. Here is this revolutionary hero. How can they take the next steps to kill someone who has become so popular, not only in Ireland, but even in other countries? So England will relent, and rather than death, they will send Mar and his compatriots to be exiled in Van Diemen's Land. At this point, Thomas Francis Mar, gentleman right here, picture of him in the jail, is 25 years old. This is where Mar goes, literally across the other side of the globe. He would spend 112 days on a vessel to his eventual destination. You'll notice this is the map of Australia. This is what we now refer to as Tasmania, then referred to as Van Diemen's Land, a blow up here to the right. 112 days to arrive here. And this had been something that had been started roughly as a penal colony. Convicts would be sent to Australia and also to Tasmania, Mar's destination being Tasmania. About 40,000 people total, most for petty crimes, theft, debt, anything else that in some senses could be manufactured. Some real, some manufactured. 25% of the population was women in this colony. Political prisoners, though, were rare. So Mar and his compatriots were not the norm in Van Diemen's Land. They were about 1%, but they carried notoriety. They carried the fame with them. Mar and the other young Irelanders would arrive on October 29, 1849, to a completely different world. Upon their arrival, they were treated much differently than the other petty criminals. Many times those criminals would be sent to a work gang, to another prison-type labor camp, but Mar and his compatriots would actually end up with quarters much like this. This is a sketch of his cabin at Lake Sorrel in the Campbelltown district. It was much like a gentleman's agreement. They had conditions of their parole. They would exist on the island. They would not be confined to crude jails. They were granted freedom of movement within their own district. So they were each given a district. Mars happened to be the one in Campbelltown. He would try to look on the bright side. It was a beautiful land. It was not Ireland, but it was still beautiful in his own right. Maybe he can make something of himself here and eventually get back to that revolution in Ireland. This was just a pause. He spent time planting vegetables, taking long walks, and expecting the various flora and fauna that this new and unique land had to offer. But while the location was quiet, his soul was not. Mar and his fellow revolutionaries still wanted to see Ireland free. So they're not going to let exile to Van Diemen's Land dissuade this or slow them down. One of the conditions of their parole is that these young men cannot speak to each other. Another is that they cannot cross into someone else's district. You must literally stay in your place. So for example, your county where you live, you cannot cross to the next county. You can go up to the line, but you cannot cross. And technically, you should not be speaking with any of your cohorts across the way. But what Mar and his friends would do is, of course, they would take it right up to the boundary. So, obviously not to scale, and the districts were not square, but the districts that he and his compatriots would exist in were adjacent. So, while not crossing into one, they could sure stand at the point where they all meet and talk to each other. Now that does violate their parole, but they're not crossing into said district. They would do this, they would meet for weekly meals and talk of escape. Of course they are. They don't want to sit here on this island forever. They have more important things to do. There was one attempted escape while Mar was at Van Diemen's Land, but it ended in betrayal. There had been a spy that had been able to warn those in charge that an escape was going to happen, and that poor individual, as they swam to the boat, hoping that that boat would pick them up to freedom, no one on the boat extended a hand. They swam back to shore, and of course, the officers were there ready to take them in. But for Mar, there was no rule that prevented him from falling in love. We mentioned 25% of the inhabitants were female, and soon Mar would find a young woman, took notice of a lady named Catherine Bennett. In fact, her carriage, she was governess for another individual on the island. That carriage had gotten caught in the road. Mar helped to fix it and then began to court her. After a brief courtship, he asked for her hand in marriage. And Mar is swept up. He is completely enthralled with Ms. Bennett. His friends, however, are not impressed. She is the daughter of a convict he is a political convict. But they still, in this instance, believe that she is below his station and therefore not worthy. But Mar will move ahead anyway. His spirit is still encouraged, though, by the attempted escape and then an eventual escape in 1850. One of his friends was able to coordinate an escape through Ireland and through other channels by having a boat pick him up off the coast of Van Diemen's Land. And Mar is energized by this. If that person can do it, then so can he. So Mar will now look to coordinate his own escape between individuals in Waterford, his father, basically, and individuals in New York. Now keep in mind, a letter written at Christmas will not reach someone's hands in Waterford until April. So trying to coordinate an escape when you have 4 months delay, I can't even imagine the stress that would put someone under. But it was done. Somehow it was done. And soon, the ship, the Elizabeth Thompson, was secured to aid Mar in his escape. This is the same ship that had picked up that gentleman back in 1850. On January 3rd, 1852, Mar, being the gentleman that he is, would send a letter to the magistrate of his district revoking his parole, basically telling the magistrate, thank you, but I'm no longer going to be abiding by this. He said, circumstances of recent occurrence urge upon me the necessity of resigning my ticket of leave, and consequently withdrawing my parole. I write this letter, therefore, respectfully to appraise you that after 12 o'clock tomorrow noon, I shall no longer consider myself bound by the obligation which that parole imposes. In the meantime, however, you should conceive it your duty to take me into custody. I shall, as a matter of course, regard myself as wholly absolved from the restraint which my word of honor to your government at present inflicts. I have the humble honor to be, sir, with sincere respect, your obedient servant, Thomas Francis Mar. Thomas Francis basically informing them that I'm no longer playing by your rules. I'm headed out. So how would he do this? The Campbelltown district here is Mar's area of operation. His route would take him from Lake Searle to Westbury, then up the Tamar River to the coast. This is not done in a day, but this is his route. And eventually, he will have to board a boat, a very almost unseaworthy boat, and go 40 miles across the coast of Van Diemen's Land to Waterhouse Island, right there. Now the island is actually only 2 miles off the shore, but in order to get there, it took him a route of 40 miles. The whole time sharks are circling beneath. There's always the potential of a double cross, as happened to an individual years ago when they tried to escape. Mar will spend 10 days on Waterhouse Island. He's brought some provisions with him. He's actually hanging out with a group of pirates. And he's waiting for the Elizabeth Thompson to show. And boats will show, but they won't be that one. And day in and day out, his hopes are up and down, waiting for the Elizabeth Thompson and her signal shots. Finally, after 10 days, he sees the boat, he sees the appropriate signal shots, and he's ferried out to the ship. Once on board, his true identity is known only to the captain. He is simply looked at as a traveler. And now he is on his way back to freedom. He'll eventually land in New York City by way of Brazil, and his arrival was expected, lauded, and celebrated. A number of newspapers had already announced his escape, and he looked up some of his friends who had departed Ireland from the Young Ireland movement. One friend in particular, Michael Corcoran, was living above a tavern. He was celebrated near and far by supporters, but politically of great concern. There was a movement afoot in America, the Know Nothing movement, which was a nativist movement, not encouraged at all by the immigration of Irish. And soon, Mar and many of his Irish compatriots would be targets once again. He would, though, bring out those speaking skills. And he would enrapture audiences as he entered the lecture circuit to again stir the movement for Ireland's freedom. He would end up traveling all over the United States. He would meet President-elect Franklin Pierce, and his wife and father actually joined him for a time. Keep in mind, he can never go back to Ireland. He is completely exiled and forbidden from returning to his homeland. However, as Marr will head out west for more speeches, both his father and his wife will return back to Ireland in hopes that a future rendezvous can be coordinated. Catherine would return to Ireland. She would give birth to a young son, Thomas Bennett Marr, but die shortly thereafter from complications. Now, the Irish in America, broken down roughly by percentage, comprise a significant portion of the population. Marr has a group of eager listeners. And many of these individuals had seen the horrors of the famine, had experienced the oppression by the English, and were more than willing to join in on the cause. Typically, though, the Irish are going to side with the Democratic Party as they are anti-abolition. Also, just mentioned fearing the Know Nothing Party and the nativist movements. And the Irish are also concerned about this potential abolition of slavery and the competition for low-paying jobs. The Irish, just as many others, were on the bottom of the ladder when it came to employment, some rights. And they feared that if these newly freed slaves joined into the citizenry, that their competition for jobs and wages would be at a premium. And there's still the revolution to fight back home, and we've got to get this organized. So Marr will reconvene with his friend Michael Corcoran, who was born in Ireland in 1827, and he has also seen the effects of the Great Famine. The ultimate goal is to avenge the persecution that it was felt by those individuals. Marr, like many others, will join the Fenian Brotherhood and become involved in the Irish nationalist movement in America. But eventually, though, as course would have it, the United States was moving to the brink of civil war. And here was an opportunity for many of these Irish to engage in what we might call training, utilize the American Civil War as a training opportunity for their own future revolution. Michael Corcoran would organize the 69th New York State Militia on the outset of the American Civil War and look to do just that. So recruiting posters would go all around. Marr would be speaking. But one of the things that the Irish found themselves in was a difficult position with their beliefs, because they could actually sympathize with the South. They could sympathize with this government that was being told how to do things, how to live, what rules to follow, but yet here is this opportunity for war and a training ground. Some would look to gain the military experience to later fight for Ireland's freedom. Others wanted to protect and fight for America and protect its freedoms and future for the future generations of the Irish. And some fought, as we know from many, many Civil War diaries, for adventure, for pay, because it was what they had to do. Marr would give a number of stirring speeches. He would look to rally the cry and fill the ranks of the Irish in the Union Army. He said, "It is a moral certainty that many of our countrymen who enlist in this struggle for the maintenance of the Union will fall in the contest. But, even so, I hold that if only 1 in 10 of us come back when this war is over, the military experience gained by that one will be of more service in a fight for Ireland's freedom than with that of the entire 10 as they are now." They needed to go through this in their thoughts. They needed to go through this, and if they could get a handful of people with the experience, the leadership, they could go back to Ireland and throw away the Crown's oppression. Forgot about that one. War begins in 1861. As the Irish were recruited, they would be sent down to Fort Corcoran, just outside of D.C. Michael Corcoran here, Marr here. Marr would eventually become a captain of the Company K, 69th New York. They were responsible for constructing forts around Arlington, but the men are green. They are untrained, as of course many of the soldiers are at the onset of the American Civil War. And it will take practice before they are truly a fighting force. On the way to Manassas, initially men had enlisted for 90 days. Lincoln is pressuring the Union Army to get something going. We don't have these men forever. So as a result, it will eventually be the Battle of Bull Run. But on the march toward Manassas, an Irishman was struck in the foot by a rifle that had discharged accidentally. Sherman, then their brigade commander, was unimpressed, didn't care, wasn't concerned about that individual. And that episode left a very poor taste in the mouths of the Irish soldiers and his style of leadership. At the Battle of Bull Run, the 69th New York State Militia will engage the afternoon of July 21st. Again, Marr leading Company K. They prepare for the assault on the Henry House Hill and attempt to attack. They're stripping their jackets off. They're kind of basically down to their bare clothes, and they will charge the hill. A writer for Harper's Weekly wrote that the Irish had stripped themselves and dashed into the enemy with the utmost fury. The difficulty was to keep them quiet, and thus their forward movement. But as many of you probably have studied this battle and well know, it's disorganized, it's not coordinated well, there's confusion among the ranks, and things just don't go well for the Union Army. It appeared that the 69th was able to hold for a time, but they were never able to push the Confederates back. As they are retreating, it is completely disorganized, and as a result, Michael Corcoran, who you see here, is captured, the colors are captured, and a variety of casualties take place, 38 killed, 95 missing, 59 wounded. One would write later that it was, after all, but a training school to open men's eyes to the real necessities and responsibilities of war. So that didn't go as planned, and now we need to regroup. We need to regroup because we know the war is not over. We all thought that it would be hashed out with this one battle, people picnicking on the hills close by. But it's going to take a lot longer. And now Marr is going to take it upon himself to form an all-Irish fighting unit. Since the 69th New York State Militia did not re-up, now we look to the 69th New York Volunteers. And he's going to look to organize them. During September and October, he is primarily focused on recruiting. He's using those talents of speech to fill the ranks of these units. These men will now re-enlist for 3 years, and he will eventually fill out the 63rd, the 69th, and the 88th New York, the bulk of which will become the famed Irish Brigade. And many times during these speeches, he would look at the men in the crowd, the men that he's asking to fight and die for him, and tell them that for my part, I ask no Irishman to do that which I myself am not prepared to do. And whether or not they understood Marr's background, I think he was speaking honestly at that point. Marr so fervently wanted Ireland's freedom that he was, I truly believe, ready to lay his life down for that cause. And if it had to be here in America through their Civil War, then so be it. And soon, as I mentioned earlier, Marr will start to realize that some of the Irish had loyalty to both countries. However, he needed to, in many of these speeches, stress England's abandonment of Ireland and the threat of the Confederacy linking with them during the Civil War. Now, not so much understanding about the South being oppressed by the federal government, but that one piece, the fact that they might align with England, that was enough to kind of move sympathies away from the South and focus on supporting the North. He needed roughly 2,000 men. He's still recruiting for a number of these regiments. And during one recruiting trip in New York, July 1862, Marr would say this. He said, "It should be the vehement desire and the intense ambition of every Irishman who has one chord within him that vibrates to the traditions of that old lyric and martial land of his, not to permit its flag, so visibly emblematic of the verdure of its soil and the immortality of its faith, to be compromised in any just struggle in which it is displayed." Trying to rally the troops to support this cause. Keep the Irish Brigade alive. Demonstrate to America that the Irish is there to fight. Again, this helps combat that know-nothing movement. America's going to be the home of future Irish immigrants. But sometimes he's having trouble getting recruits to join the ranks. Some of that is because the letters are coming home, the realities of war. One person, Captain James B. Turner, would say, "As to any idea you may have of joining the army, give it up at once. Unless a man occupies a position among the very highest, the amount of vulgarity, profanity, and utter tyranny that exists is to a man of any regiment a perfect hell." Life in the officer corps was a little bit different than life in the field. The Irish Brigade would be thrust into, among a number of other battles, more widely known the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. There we go. They will attack toward the sunken road held by Confederates. But as they crest, the infantry fire is basically going to mow them down in their tracks. The 63rd is going to take heavy casualties. Most survivors are falling to the ground simply for protection. Marr, who has gone into battle upon his horse, is now thrown to the ground and the animal when it was killed. While Marr's father was a teetotaler, Marr was not. Marr was known to imbibe, but I think a lot of the detraction of Marr when it comes to his use of alcohol is actually more from those looking to tear down Marr and his politics rather than Marr the person, so to speak. Because of who Marr was, because of the revolution that he wanted to start, he becomes an easy target. I think that, and agree with some of the authors, having read through a number of the books, that you can't get a famed reputation as an elite fighting force with a commander that's necessarily behind a haystack drinking. I think Marr was a true leader. I think Marr was completely sober during the battles that will take place, maybe not some of his personal battles later in life, but during this portion of his life, I think Marr's focus, being on that revolution, being on the leadership of his men, was in fact very much tantamount to him rather than descending into drink. But of course, that's an easy story to write. That's going to sell newspapers. So the Irish are poised to attack the sunken road, which is heavily fortified. They're fighting with 69 caliber smoothbore muskets. They're advancing through hails of gunfire. One will note, James Turner from the 88th New York said, "The shot and shell of the enemy poured over our heads and crashed into the hollow to the rear. The bullets are whirring about, an occasional wounded man falling down and is borne to the rear, but we have not yet been commenced to fire." They've got to be close. When you use a 69 caliber, you buck and ball, you basically have to be close or else you're not really going to hit much of anything. And Marr had actually requested these rifles specifically. Being close, being in the fray, signified prominence. As they continued, men fell all around. The acting major of the 69th fell dead, and a succession of color bearers of the 88th New York would fall as well. Captain Patrick Clooney, the gentleman you see here, advanced. His courage, though, would come to a quick end when he was hit in both the head and chest within 30 feet of the sunken road. They got close, but they could not break through. One Mississippi soldier would write, "They stood in line on their ridge, in plain view with 3 flags as colors, one the stars and stripes, one a state flag, and one the green flag with the harp of Aaron. Our men kept those flags falling fast, while just as fast they raised again. Several times the deadly fire of our rifles broke the ranks of those men, and they fell behind the ridge, but quickly reformed each time and appeared with shorter lines, but still defiant. What was the cost? And this is going to fuel Irish discontent. The fact that all of these men are dying, and the fact that the Union Army is struggling to win decisive victories against the Confederate Army is making a lot of people question why they are sending husbands, brothers, and sons off to die in this war, which for some is not their own. They've come to America to flee Ireland. They want to get back to Ireland and remove the rule of England there. This is not going to help. In addition to the casualties, the losses taken at Antietam, a political blow will hit the Irish in the introduction of the Emancipation Proclamation. As we had mentioned previously, the threat of former slave labor coming into the workforce is very real to the Irish. And now that Lincoln has introduced this, it's one more concern that they have. Again, why are they fighting a war that potentially is not their own? And yet they get no reprieve. The Irish Brigade will then continue with the Union Army, now led by a different commander, General Ambrose Burnside, into the throes of Fredericksburg, Virginia, in December. They would not have their Irish flags with them. They were simply too tattered to be taken into battle, sent back to New York for repair. And what they would instead end up doing is placing sprigs of boxwood in their hats to identify their group. Finally, on December 11th, Burnside will order the Union Army, to cross into Fredericksburg, and the battle will begin on the 13th. St. Clair Mulholland will write, as the Irish are advancing through the town of Fredericksburg and up toward Maurice Heights and the stone wall beyond, he says, "The hills rain fire and the men advance with heads bowed, as when walking against a hailstorm. Still through the deadly shower the ever-thinning lines pressed on. The plain over which they had passed was thickly spotted with the men of the Second Corps, dead in twos and threes and in groups. Regiments and companies had their third and fourth commander, and the colors were borne to the front by the third or fourth gallant soul who had raised them." Ironically, at the wall were fellow Irish. So not only brother against brother, but now countrymen, literally against countrymen. They were the Lochran Guards and Philip's Legion of Georgia. Mulholland would write again, "Bone of their bone and flesh of their flesh, the soldiers of Cobb's brigade were Irish like ourselves." In total, approximately 13 assaults against the Confederates, the 69th New York arriving just shy of 50 yards in front of the stone wall. Father William Corby, chaplain with the Irish Brigade, would then write, "The place into which Marr's brigade was sent was simply a slaughter pen." As Marr waited for the troops and stragglers, he amassed about 300 men still left in the Irish Brigade. Some of the Confederate soldiers of the Washington Artillery placed on those heights mentioned the Irish Brigade's courage. They said, "Our fire was murderous, and no troops on earth could stand the foe we were giving them. In the foremost, like we distinguished the green flag with the golden harp of old Ireland, and we knew it to be Marr's brigade. The gallantry of the enemy pushed on beyond all former charges, and fought and left their dead within 25 paces of the sunken road." And yet Marr is still not able to go back and recruit. He is struggling with the purpose of this recruitment and now what he's going to say to many of these men. In an attempt to lighten the spirits, as the new year commenced, as the soldiers were in winter camp, Marr would attempt to bring some levity back to a significant depression that many of these men were going through. He would hold St. Patrick's Day events. He had contests for the enlisted men, foot races, weight throwing, Irish dancing, wheelbarrow races, sack races, and the catching of a greased pig. He had entered his horse in one of the steeplechase races, but an aide actually rode the horse. He didn't fare well because that aide had probably been making the whiskey punch earlier that day. The races were open to everyone. At 1 o'clock, though, there was a break for intermission. It was time to eat. And so lunch consisted of ham, roast oxen, stuffed pigs, turkey, duck, and various other game animals. This is part of the steeplechase that would take place in camp. Winner takes all. Again, the viewing stands, as you can see. And for those interested, I always supply the recipe for the whiskey punch. There you go. I think you can see why his aide was not able to take first. But as winter camp will soon be broken because the fighting season rolls in again once spring arrives, the Irish Brigade is still going to be in the thick of things. They will be involved in the Battle of Chancellorsville in late April, early May, 1863. After 3 days of battle, again under another Union Army commander, General Joe Hooker, he's lost roughly 18,000 men in casualties. And the remnants of the Irish Brigade have suffered as well. With the growing frustration that Marr is seeing and feeling, he will tender his resignation at the close of this battle. He will do so much the way the colonies, in a sense, tendered their resignation to King George. He will basically send Hooker a battle-by-battle outline of the slights and mistreatments that the Irish Brigade suffers while becoming one of the most heroic units of the Army of the Potomac. He will eventually return to New York City, looking for what to do next. Maybe it will appear to him. Maybe he will have to find it on his own. By July, though, he will find himself in the midst of the draft riots in New York City. Many of the soldiers from Gettysburg will then travel there to help quell that disturbance. And this goes back to those casualties at Antietam. The Irish are done. They are done fighting for this. They are done looking at the lists of names that arrive in the newspapers, those that are killed and wounded, missing, captured. And they are tired of the mistreatments that are being suffered not only in the army, but mistreatments that are being suffered at home as well. And Marr realizes that had they known where he was, they probably would have taken him out too in those draft riots. He no longer had the standing that he once had. He was the one that went to these halls, to the rooms, on the soapbox, using his words to paint a picture of what could be done. And now this picture is very different. The picture is very real for many of these families. They were also, the people of New York City, specifically the people of New York City, the Irish of New York City, are facing conscription. They're facing being drafted unless they can come up with $300 to pay for a replacement. And that is a year's salary plus for many of these individuals, so they have no choice. Marr had recruited these men. He had sold them on the idea of freedom and purpose, and now he had led them, many of them, to their untimely death. And for what? To go back to his speech so that 1 in 10 of us might fight for Ireland's freedom? He hardly even had a 1 left. Hindsight, unfortunately, painted a quite unpleasant picture. But Marr still needed something to do. He will be back in the Army by September 1864, ordered to guard the Union supply line from Nashville to Atlanta. And who's at the forefront? William Sherman. He was then handed command of a group of men in various states of convalescing, some from illness, some from poor decision-making, called the Provisional Army of Tennessee, about 10,000 strong. It was really kind of a ragtag group of folks that didn't have anywhere to go. And ironically, that sort of fit Marr at this point. Unfortunately for him, he was a bit too much like the men. He wasn't maintaining control. Some of these guys got out of hand. Marr, in fact, ended up in Baltimore, I believe. And the group created even poorer names for themselves and Marr was thus removed from the Union Army in March of 1865. His career as a soldier, at least in the United States Army, over. Where would he go? What would he do? Again, Marr now needs a purpose. In Ireland, he was with the Young Ireland movement. In Tasmania, he was looking to keep the movement afoot and escape. That was his purpose. In America, he came to New York and rallied the men to fight in this Civil War. Now he needs something else. He always needs that goal that is almost unachievable, unattainable, but yet still pursues them. His new adventure would take him to the Montana Territory. He had mentioned it earlier in previous correspondence, send me out there, I might be able to find my fame and fortune, my paraphrase. But now this has the potential of new beginnings, and in his mind it has the potential to become a new Ireland. Bring the people from New York, bring the people from the cities, get the Irish who are coming to America to go even further, which is not an easy feat, especially when you're arriving here with little to nothing to start. But come out to Ireland, and now we will form our new country. President Andrew Johnson had actually appointed Marr Secretary of Montana, and he was to literally create its government from scratch. In September of 1865, Marr arrived and settled in Virginia City, the territorial capital. Upon meeting Sidney Edgerton, the territorial governor at that time, Marr was quickly informed that governing, law, and due process were very much optional in this neck of the woods. That he should toe the line, or else the vigilante justice system would seek him out. They had already killed about 20 people that month. And good luck with the budget. There was none. Oh, and by the way, Edgerton, holding his suitcase, was on the way out. You're now governor. And Edgerton was gone. Edgerton hadn't even told the president that he was leaving. Virginia City was rough, as many of these western towns are going to start out being. They're not going to be the fine dining capitals of the world. They're going to be literally made from scratch by the backs of individuals. And he, of course, wasn't welcome. He's not welcome into the vigilante justice system because he's going to try and impose law and order. He had no respect from some individuals. He had respect from others, but they were going to keep that quiet for fear of their life. His early attempts at moving the state forward in some enlightened thinking were shot down simply because Marr was trying to make plans for a public school system. The leader of the opposition movement there did not like the fact that Marr was not going to incorporate the King James Bible into the curriculum. Now, keeping in mind where Marr has come from, Marr clearly wants a separation of church and state. He does not want the school system to be teaching religion of any sort. He's been through that long ago. So, of course, that will lead to a smear campaign by the vigilantes against Marr. They will, rumors again of his intoxication. Of course, that I'm sure probably preceded him because depending on which newspaper you read, which story you heard, I'm sure that preceded him. And they would say that he was at all times polluting his bed in person in the most indecent and disgusting manner. Of course, Marr is still, in his attempt to take the higher road, is still going to attempt to govern the territory. But he may have sealed his own fate when he involved himself in the case of a Mr. Daniels. James Daniels had purportedly found himself staring down a not-so-honest card player and in the midst of a fight defended himself. The gentleman, I believe, was stabbed to death. For this, he was brought before a judge and sentenced to 3 years in the penitentiary. People came to Mr. Daniels' defense. They said that sentence is much too strong. Is there anything that you can do, Mr. Marr? And they had hoped for a pardon. That is something that only the president can do. But what Marr could do was he could ask for a different sentence. He could ask for a reprieve, and he did so. And what would happen is, rather than being sent to the penitentiary, Daniels received a reprieve. For this, a gentleman named Wilbur Sanders, leader of that vigilante movement, was livid as it reversed the due process that had taken place earlier. Daniels, who was going to be released from jail in the morning, once Marr grants the reprieve, would find that the vigilantes saw to it by night he was dead and hanging from a tree. Supposedly, there was a note pinned to the body that read, "The acting one is next." Not to be dissuaded, Marr is going to reconvene the legislature, March 5th, 1866. To show you how gritty territorial government was, the House met above a saloon, and the council met in a billiard hall. Marr will reintroduce the concept of public school. He's not dissuaded. He will fire the editor of the Montana Post, who's actually also the school superintendent, and the first Montana public school will open in Virginia City. He had nothing to lose. If the vigilantes were going to come after them, then at least he'd try and accomplish something. For 38 days, he kept the legislators going with 74 meals, 19 bottles of wine, 12 pitchers of beer, 43 cigars, and they passed 64 bills while they were there. And now, of course, this is only going to inflame the vigilantes. Marr is also facing personal difficulties as well. He's broke. He's not received a salary while acting governor of Montana. And when Edgerton said that there was no budget, he meant that. There was no budget. There was no money coming in to pay for Marr's time. Any money that he had left over from his father was gone. Any money that he had from his speaking engagements was gone. And the opportunities for speaking engagements in this area was limited. Still attempting to conduct his business, he's actually going to go travel to Fort Benton, Montana. He's been requesting some supplies, specifically arms, to be given to militia to protect themselves from any conflict with some of the native inhabitants. But they hadn't arrived yet. It took a while for them to arrive. And the person who was the officer that could release these arms, William Sherman. Finally, though, it was agreed that they would arrive at Fort Benton and Marr would travel to go pick them up. He was fighting a stomach ailment. He will rest at the home of a Mr. Baker. The arms had not arrived yet, so he was going to have to figure out something else to do. It turned out that as Marr is in Fort Benton, a gentleman, Mr. Baker, was not the name of the house. While at the house, a gentleman had returned from D.C. who was there to plot against Marr. Marr was taking his meals, relaxing, hoping to get rid of the stomach bug, but he could tell there was tension in the town. He could tell that people were looking at him a little bit differently. As he boarded a boat, the G.A. Thompson, the pilot of the boat, Johnny Doran, invited him to dine with him, provided him a stateroom, and Marr, initially declining, eventually accepted, upon persuasion that there was a very significant library on the boat. And Marr, just looking for a chance to escape, thought this a good idea. When dinner concluded, Marr went back to his stateroom to retire for the evening. Unfortunately, at 10 p.m., there was a cry of man overboard. It was sounded, and Doran feared that it was Marr. He just knew something was not right. Ropes were thrown, lights were cast to attempt to save the man, and nothing could be done. Thomas Francis Marr, survivor of the Revolution, survivor of banishment, and of civil war, could not survive vigilante justice. It had caught up with him. Though searches continued for days afterward, Marr's body was never found, and so the theories came. Suicide? Probably not for an Irish Catholic. even though he had been barely eking out an existence, he was still focused. He still had purpose. He wasn't that far gone. A drunken accident. There is documentation that Marr partook of some wine during the meal, but no one left record of him stumbling, incoherent, completely drunk, nothing of the sort. And so that leaves murder, assassination, potentially. And potentially, most likely conducted by the leader of, the theory goes that the leader of the vigilante justice movement, Wilbur Sanders. But there is no conclusive proof. Nothing conclusive. It's pretty solid, but nothing conclusive. In the years following Marr's death, Sanders would actually be the one to write the history of Montana. And when you have that power, when you have that ability, you write the narrative. You chart the course on who's going to be remembered and how. Sanders will actually become the biggest supporter of Marr in these histories. But in reality, he may have had a hand in his death. There was, sometime later, about 1913, a gentleman, Frank Diamond, who said he was paid $8,000 to push Marr over the rail. Now, that confession came, and then I believe the individual realized that the statute of limitations on this crime had not run out, and so quickly recanted. And so, I didn't mean that. I was ill, and now I'm back to my senses. And so, unfortunately, as I said, that became useless. We may never know definitively what happened to Thomas Francis Marr that night, but his story is one of the ages. This young revolutionary who charted a course, who successfully escaped an island, who took a fighting force and made it one of the most revered in the Union Army while battling character assaults the whole way. His story still stands. The free spirit, the revolutionary, the fugitive, the Civil War general, and eventually the governor of Montana. He had hoped to be remembered by the Irish in Ireland. I suspect that he had no expectation that he would gather the Australians and the Americans too. So with that, I give you Thomas Francis Marr. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. I appreciate your attention. If you have any questions, come on down and we'll chat. If not, I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Gettysburg.